Hey guys, I'm Ted, here to give you another lecture, and for today's lecture we will continue on with our discussion of the industrial improvements in the late early republic. But before we begin that, I just like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we last discussed. So in our last lecture, we discussed the Amistad case and how it sent literally just shock waves and horror through the slave-owning elites as they saw their greatest fear, a successful slave uprising, unfold and the perpetrators of the uprising be unpunished by their northern compatriots. Indeed, the Supreme Court ordered the slaves released and returned to Africa. We saw the South begin to develop scientific racist theories to sort of justify slavery in the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion, when the slaves are content and happy and generally unopposed to their lives as slaves. After the Turner Rebellion, that argument could not be used anymore, so they turned to scientific racism, arguing that slaves are perfectly suited, that they are the best suited in the Republic to be exploited as workers. We also discussed how there was a discord within the abolitionist movement itself. Much of it caused by William Lloyd Garrison, who, while passionate in his opposition to slavery and the expansion of slavery, was nonetheless abrasive and not really the best person to work with in northern circles. And lastly, we discussed how the South, in the aftermath to the rise of abolitionism, the Amistad case, and in the string of rebellions that they had to face in their own backyard, namely Nat Turner's rebellion and Denmark Vesey's rebellions, the South began to intensify their defense of slavery. They will begin from this moment on, from the Amistad case, from the 1840s on, they will brook no opposition to slavery. It will be a complete and utter defense of slavery at the state and national level, or they would not co-sign anything. And with that being said, I'd like to jump straight into our lecture for today, which would be the further industrial improvements in the Republic, in the early Republic. And to begin with, I'd like to talk about railroads. And now, railroads at first played a secondary role. They were the second fiddle to steamboats because of the tremendous amounts of capital needed to invest in railroads. In the early Republic, railroads or railroad track laying began in earnest in 1815 when John Stevens, a Revolutionary War veteran, received a license from the New Jersey State Legislature to construct a railway. Unfortunately, Stevens was never able to raise the capital to construct the railway, but railways nonetheless were constructed in the early Republic. For example, the Charleston-Hamburg Railway in South Carolina was a very early important railway. The Baltimore and Ohio Railway was another, which ran from the Maryland port city of Baltimore across the Appalachian Mountains to the Ohio River. Peter Cooper, who we discussed in a previous lecture, Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb was one of the first viable locomotives, being capable of negotiating the perils of the rail lines, paths, and light enough to not break the rails, which was a major hindrance in the early days of rail travel. The locomotives, the engines in the cars of the trains were so heavy that they often broke the rails. But Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb was just light enough to be able to maneuver swiftly, and also light enough to not be such a burden on the rail lines themselves. Now, in New York, the Mohawk and Hudson line, which complemented the Erie Canal, launched a locomotive named after DeWitt Clinton. It was called the DeWitt Clinton, and it took passengers 16 miles Its maiden trip took passengers 16 miles in August of 1831, but the DeWitt Clinton showered her passengers with sparks. But her speed was so incredible to observers. From that moment on, railroads caught on, and their speed and their reliability improved. The early railways were short, with trips being really from town to town. The Erie Railway, which linked New York City with Dunkirk, with the small town of Dunkirk on Lake Erie, took 16 years to build, being finally completed in 1851. And the company that constructed the line faced a number of hardships, from lack of funds, from difficulties in acquiring land for the rail line, retaining their labor force. There was a high turnover in early rail line workers, the line layers, the track layers, and they also had difficulty finding functioning equipment to repair tools and to also lay the tracks. And this meant that the early rail lines and locomotives were really of poor quality. So early passengers actually had to, when they purchased their tickets, they also had to promise to assist in helping to lift derailed locomotives back onto the track and to help shovel away snow during winter travels. And the travel itself was really hazardous. It was a very arduous journey to undertake. When the locomotive crashed, for example, especially during the winter, it often resulted in fatal fires. Now there weren't a whole lot of crashes, train crashes, but they did occur. There was an occurrence of fatal collisions, and the fires. The fatal fires occurred because the early locomotives were not made of steel; they were made of wood. It really wasn't until the late 1890s that locomotives were completely made of steel. And from locomotives and the hazards and the perils of early locomotive travel, we jump to Samuel Morse. Now, Morse began a career as a painter who copied the big name, the more impressive, the more well-known paintings in the Louvre, before becoming a art history professor and a minor political figure as a leader of the nativist and anti-Catholics in the early republic. There was a great fear among 19th century Protestant Americans. I'm sorry, it's really late where I'm at. I'm trying to get the lecture done. But there was a great fear among 19th century Protestant Americans that immigrants, especially Irish Catholic immigrants, were going to undermine the integrity of the United States. And Morse was an outspoken anti-Catholic. He gave up art after being passed over to paint the new Capitol building in Washington. And in a grief, he turned to other pursuits, namely perfecting a communication system he observed in France, the semaphore. Now, the semaphore system brought news to Paris from France's ports. When ships came in, a set of towers outfitted with flags and mechanical moving arms really relayed the messages. Sorry about that. A set of towers outfitted with flags and mechanical moving arms relayed messages. Now, this system worked amazingly during the day and in good weather. At night and in bad weather, it was hopelessly useful. Morse, seeing the opportunity, decided to work on using electrical current to improve this system. Morse researched the works of others and found that Joseph Henry had worked out a system that used electric current to ring a bell that was a mile away. Morse's contribution was to devise a distinctive alphabet of electric pulses that appeared as dots and dashes that could be sent over wire cable. and then converted into English. Sorry about that. And in 1838, Morse. In 1838, Morse successfully demonstrated his achievement before Congress, but he struggled to make his system work over long distances. And at this time, there were no power plants, so it was quite difficult for Morse to maintain the electrical charge to send his dispatches over long distances. So it wouldn't be until 1844 that Morse succeeded in sending a message, a long distance message, and in 1844 he sent the message, "What hath God wrought?" Very famous quote in world history, very famous quote in the history of communication. Morse sent that message from the United States Supreme Court building in Washington to Baltimore, and that was a distance of some 35 miles. The telegraph quickly caught on in popularity. Great Britain and France were joined by telegraph in 1851, and the United States and Great Britain were joined by telegraph in 1858. The telegraph between the United States and Great Britain were damaged. It actually failed shortly afterwards and would not really be repaired until 1865, after the conclusion of the American Civil War. Now, the appearance of the telegraph and the locomotive were great improvements, and they really improved the rate at which reliable information could be disseminated. You have to remember that before the telegraph and locomotives, steamboats were just beginning to catch on. Everything was either sail powered. If you were traveling across the seas, it was going to be sail powered, and if you were traveling overland, then you're going at the speed of a wagon, of a horse-drawn carriage, or the speed of a horse. But of course, with the locomotive, you're now moving way faster than a horse could move, and with the telegraph, you're sending messages even faster than the locomotive. Now, with all of these improvements to transportation and it's really late. With all of these improvements to transportation and communication, it was only a matter of time before the military implications of industrial manufacturing began to come into effect. Eli Whitney had implemented replaceable parts to manufacture rifles for the United States, but Whitney had largely failed to meet his goal. He had proven that replaceable parts was going to be the future for mechanized machines. Mechanized units and so forth. But Whitney himself had really failed to meet his goal of supplying the United States Army with enough rifles and to have enough functioning rifles for them. It fell to Samuel Colt, and Colt himself is a very intriguing figure in 19th century American business. He, on the one hand, was a very shrewd investor and manufacturer with a keen grasp of business. He was really deeply rooted in reality. But he was also a showman and what we call a huckster. He would attempt to sell snow to an Eskimo. While not calling it snow, probably call it like an ice donut or something like that. But he would attempt to sell snow to an Eskimo. And he occasionally defrauded his own friends and investors. And Colt was also known to bribe congressmen to ensure that he got favorable tie tongue there for a minute, legislation passed through Congress. But he was also more successful than Whitney at mass producing firearms. Colt was the first person to figure out how to fire a revolver without all the chambers igniting at once. A major problem with early firearms, particularly revolvers, was that when you struck one bullet, when you fired one bullet, there would be this sort of echo effect that would ignite all of the rounds in the chamber, causing them all to go off at once, really explode, while the user was still holding the pistol in his hand. Colt figured out how to fire each shot one by one, and he nearly went bankrupt as a result of the Panic of 1837, but he being Samuel Colt, he found a way, and his revolvers actually became very popular during the Mexican War because they were the ideal close-quarter weapons. Rifles are long, and it is difficult to close with the rifle. It's difficult to really maneuver with the rifle, to fire and to simply shrug on. If you're moving with the rifle and you close, then you're not using the rifle as a firearm. You're using it basically as a spear. You're either going to be butting somebody with the you're gonna striking somebody with the butt of the rifle, or you're going to be, and this is for 19th century combat, you're going to be bayoneting somebody with the muzzle, with the end of the rifle. But with Colt's pistols, they were short, they were small, easy to manage, and easy to fire, and also easy to reload. You have multiple shots with them. You have 6 shots with the pistols, so you could fire, and then reload, and really just operate at a close distance, really just with an advantage over your opponent closing with the rifle. After the Mexican War, Colt's pistols remained popular. After the war, after the Mexican War, gold was discovered. Well, really before, about 6 days before the official end of the Mexican War, gold was discovered in California, setting off a huge migration western to the western edge of North America, to the Pacific coast, has men, women, and children participating in the California gold rush between 1848, 49, and 50. And it was a really dangerous time. People were really lawless at this time. There was a lot of lawlessness in California. California really lived up to the sort of stereotypical notion of the West being a lawless place where thieves and bandits and just sort of robbery gangs operated. And people were encouraged. There were actually magazines. There was actually a travel guide that advocated taking a Colt pistol with you if you were going to go out west. Again, highlighting that it was a pretty accurate weapon, easy to reload, and very manageable in a tight spot. If someone tried to grab you, it would be really easy for you to get to the pistol and fire the pistol. And as a matter of fact, Colt would end up selling over 320,000 of his 1949 model of his pocket pistols, as they were called. And that wraps up our lecture on industrial improvements. Hope you guys found it enlightening and entertaining. A lot of people find it really funny about the pistols, Colt pistols, and about the career of Samuel Colt. But I hope you guys liked it. Of course, enjoyed it, found it entertaining. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. And let me know what you guys thought about this lesson. Let me know if you guys are in the we find Samuel Colt extremely funny. Well, not really funny, but just entertaining. Some of the antics that he got up to. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.